One member of this church spent some time in Houston in the 1960s, working in a community action program addressing poverty. Soon after I began, this white Westsider told me, an African-American man, about 20 years older than I, took me under his wing. He took me everywhere with him, most often to all Black communities. Because I was with him, I was completely accepted. I had multiple aha moments every week as I witnessed firsthand the grit, humanity, courage, and sense of humor of the people in those communities. He goes on, one day I sat for 2 hours in a barber shop listening to personal stories, told with a combination of pain and anger masked by humor. As I stood up when we were leaving, I was surprised to see the reflection of a white person, me, in one of the mirrors. For 2 hours, I had seen only Black men. I began to understand how those Black men had felt all of their lives in our white-dominated culture. I will never forget that experience. Aha. I invited several folks who had been participating in our adult religious education series on Dismantling White Supremacy from Within to share some of their aha moments from the class or just from their lives in general. This was one of the more dramatic ones. And by the way, all of the anecdotes that I'll relay today are shared with permission. Others described growing up with segregation, like going to a lily white elementary school and encountering African Americans mainly in service jobs, like plowing streets or working as a maid. Another white member spoke of attending college at UT Austin, which was ostensibly integrated at that time, yet never having a personal interaction with a Black student. One raised in the Southern Baptist Church says, I never did hear anyone mention the fact that the reason we were called Southern Baptists was because our founders had supported slavery in the U.S. I was not to discover that detail until many years later, long after I had left the church. I can vaguely remember hearing a man in the church say that we shouldn't be mixing the races, but the issue was rarely talked about. It's a common theme for white people in this country. While some people did grow up with overt racism, freely expressed by those around them, many note that although it was obvious from observation that people of color had a different lot in life than white people, it wasn't talked about. As one person put it, there was a silence on race by the adults in my life at the time. And even when they did discuss things like the troubles with school integration or riots or assassinations, there were silences around their words that stood out to me more than anything they said. White supremacy is slippery, it morphs. When it was no longer socially acceptable to talk openly about race, the rule became, you just don't talk about it. Except, of course, that now we were seeing that there have always been groups of white people who kept talking privately about race. And recently, they have been emboldened to express their views more publicly. I'm so glad that many people here at Westside have decided it's important to engage in these conversations and not let extremists have all the air. It's time for more white people to break the silence around race, to unearth all that we've been taught by words or silence, and even to recognize all that may have been stuffed down in our bodies and emotions. Those attending the Adult Religious Education series that's ending right now, they're having their last session, have been doing that. And those who participated last year in Westside's anti-racist parenting group engaged in that work with each other and with their children. And I'm sure there'll be more opportunities here in the future, so stay tuned for those. One thing I think the silences around race teach us, white people especially, is not to notice or remember what we actually see, even our own experiences. It can get suppressed or blocked out from our attention. Over the last few years, I have found myself noticing names of the places I go and recognizing with sadness the history behind those names. A few weeks ago, I decided to check out a new park in Northwest Fort Worth. From where we live on the southwest side, I drove through White Settlement. The white and white settlement, I learned, doesn't have to do with black and white, but with European settlers pressing into Texas from the east, displacing the indigenous people who were already here. When I exited 820, I took Cahoba Drive to get to the park, passing Navajo Trail and Hiawatha Trail. And don't even get me started on the road one must travel to get to the Fort Worth Nature Preserve, called Confederate Highway. Everywhere I have lived, something in the name has given away the conflicts over natural resources and power. You can tell who was there first. Iowa comes from an indigenous people. Indiana is named for how the European settlers perceived it, full of Indians. California was named by the Spanish conquistadors after a mythical paradise. The name of Texas, too, is a reminder that this land was colonized by the Spanish before it was wrested away by the United States. Even my beloved Mississippi River, which my hometown in Iowa nestles against, contains another name taken from Native Americans. These names have been there all my life. But it was only a few years ago that I really started noticing the story they all told. A story of power and erasure. Recent research sheds light on what we pay attention to. A study gauged what people looked at in the environment with objects at different scales. The object was presented either at a normal scale, appeared at 4 times its normal size, or was absent altogether. One picture, for example, had a bathroom scene with a regular toothbrush on the counter and also a giant toothbrush running the entire length of the counter at the back against the mirror. What did the study find? As one cognitive psychologist put it, what we pay attention to is largely determined by our expectations of what should be present. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, even a giant toothbrush, because we aren't expecting it, or our assumptions about it are incorrect. The article didn't say this, but I have to wonder how often we don't notice things because we have been conditioned by our society not to notice certain kinds of things. For those of us who are white, things like white privilege in our own lives and ugly sides of our shared history. This was brought home for me by a recent voting experience. I went to the Benbrook Community Center a few months ago to vote for a school board candidate. It was a Saturday morning, and I brought my daughter with me. As I was going about my business in the voting booth, 2 of the volunteers began to speak scornfully about me. I finally turned and confronted them. I was only 10 feet from them, and they weren't bothering even to whisper. They just stared at me with stony faces. I quickly left with my curly-headed child. When I got home and told my husband, a black man, about this, he suggested to me that their hostility had everything to do with race. The polling volunteers were probably unnerved by the sight of a white woman with a biracial child. This had not occurred to me while I was there, and I was rather taken aback by the thought. The people who had sat there criticizing me were 2 older white women, and I recalled that a young Latino man, also a polling volunteer, had silently shaken his head and smiled sympathetically at me and my child when I called the 2 ladies on their rudeness. Now I think my husband was probably right, but I hadn't seen it in the moment. Or maybe it had occurred to me, and I just didn't want to let that in. Of course, white supremacy goes far beyond individual prejudices. It's about systemic injustices in all of our social institutions. The criminal justice system is one area that more of us have become painfully aware of in recent years, thanks in part to the consciousness-raising work of groups like the Black Lives Matter movement. I was interested a few months ago to read that Black Lives Matter had actually received the Sidney Prize, which is given each year to a nominee who has promoted peace with justice, human rights, and nonviolence. For those of us who have little personal interaction with the criminal justice system, instances of police brutality, like those Black Lives Matter spotlights, may seem far away. But if we stop to notice, and if we draw our family and friends out of the silence the white supremacy lulls us into, and talk more about the role of race in our lives, there are surely areas of personal experience where we can all trace its impact. I was pen pals with my grandmother, Ruby, for much of my life. In her last few years, she grew more reflective. Although she didn't mean it to, the portrait she drew of Iowa farm life and my grandfather's industrious nature reminded me that the farm that has benefited my family financially for all of my life was the result not only of a lot of hard work, but also of white privilege. She wrote that Grandpa Ron did custom combining for many of the neighbors and always had more work than he possibly could do. On their own farm, the Woodburys grew corn, soybeans, oats, and hay, raised animals too, hired helpers, and over the years expanded their farm on some of the best land in Iowa, some of the best farmland in the world. Grandpa Ron was both a hardworking laborer and an astute businessman. He built up considerable wealth for the family, not just income, but assets of land and shrewd investments. As I grew up, my mother, who had known poverty as a child, helped me understand how fortunate we were to continue benefiting from the resulting wealth. Not just for the pop-up camper and all the presents under my childhood Christmas tree that farm money helped to pay for, but for the AT&T stock Grandma and Grandpa Woodbury gave to start college funds for me and my brother when we were quite small, and gifts I received even as an adult. This cushion of savings gave me a greater sense of financial security and freedom to follow my bliss. In my 20s, I worked for modest pay in the nonprofit sector because I wanted to do meaningful work. In my 30s, I sold my house and moved across the country to California to work for a meditation center at less than a living wage. In more recent years, I spent down my savings after I quit work and entered seminary. None of these choices would have been possible, at least not with the same sense that I'll be okay, if not for the resources that my hardworking grandparents had built up and shared across generations. The factor of race, which went unremarked all my life in letters and conversations with my grandparents, became clear to me later. In one of her last letters to me, Grandma mentioned how Grandpa sold most of the chickens she raised, in her words, to the chicken shack in the Negro neighborhood called the Flats. He also would take a flatbed trailer behind the tractor, drive to the Negro part of town, the Flats, spread the word that he'd pay so much for any of the kids that would pack a lunch and take a drink along and come work for him weeding the beans. Now, I'm betting that many of the people of the Flats worked just as hard as Grandma and Grandpa, but without the same opportunity to live where they chose or accumulate land and family wealth from their efforts. As I have learned about the other side of my child's family, her dad's African-American side, it's a different story. My in-laws were part of the great migration of Blacks who left the South looking for opportunity in the North in the 20th century. My mother-in-law, William's mom, Delphia, told me she didn't know if anyone in her family had ever received the 40 acres and a mule promised to the freed slaves during Reconstruction. By the time she was growing up, they were sharecroppers, paying someone else to grow crops on their land. We raised everything, but we didn't own it, Delphia told me. Her mother had come to visit a nephew in Indiana who was doing well raising corn there, and she encouraged Delphia to leave home so she could give her family a better life. So William's parents packed up their belongings and traveled north with their children, settling in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is where William was born. Eventually, they were able to buy some land from a local black woman who had bonded with them like family. William's dad built their house, and they farmed on their 3.5 acres. Unlike my grandparents' Iowa farm, this small Indiana farm was not a source of income. It allowed them to feed their large family and be nearly self-sufficient, providing everything except for flour and sugar, which were all they bought from the store. I'm sure they worked just as hard in their lives as my grandparents did, but their opportunities were limited by pervasive systems of white supremacy. Although they could finally own a little bit of land, they were not able to build up the same kind of wealth that my family did to benefit their descendants. The more we are able to look at our history and talk about such experiences that still continue to this day, the more we can do something about it. But it's hard sometimes. One Westsider told me, "I would not trade my Texas heritage for any other. I remember the unhurried quality of life before so many of the changes happen in the world, the hospitality, the music, which I still love. But my pride in my Texanness and Southernness," he said, "is blended with pain and sadness for the bigotry that my immediate forebears, whom I still love, express with their lives, and with brokenness that same bigotry still occasionally finds expression in my thoughts and words and actions in 2017. So, he says, I participate in dismantling white supremacy from the inside, the class, because I personally am not whole on this divisive issue and long for healing for all of us. Another white Westsider told me that the thing that was most sticking with her from the class was the question, why is this so hard for me to talk about? Because I thought of several memories from childhood, she said, and I began to feel bad. And I thought, there's something about this that I'm not catching. And then I realized that I had gotten into my shame. She mentioned there were some family situations that she won't even talk about. A sense of shame can shut us up, she said. You just don't want to go there. It's almost like a shame that's carried from generations. I really appreciated this person's readiness to name such feelings. Shame, guilt, confusion. Looking right at white supremacy and its many manifestations in our lives can bring up harsh feelings. It's a common part of the process that many white people experience when they engage in these issues. I certainly have. But for those who are willing to keep on learning and talking, you can move through it to the other side. In fact, the same person who shared the sense of family shame had also recounted several stories of speaking out with people in her life. She had challenged an aunt and saw this family member dramatically change her attitudes over the course of time. She had also spoken up on behalf of a person of color in her social circles and learned how much it meant to that person. So, white people don't have to get stuck in guilt or shame. We don't. It isn't fair the way things are, but none of us chooses what we are born into. We can only choose what we do from here. Dr. King certainly urged us not to be silent or complacent, but to act. If we Unitarian Universalists of all colors still believe in that vision of beloved community that drew many of our number to march with Dr. King and Selma, then we cannot stop with that moment in UU history. We have got to keep talking, keep feeling, and keep listening to other people. We've got to be ready to tell a friend when they have a smudge on their face, as expressed in the Time for All Ages, if they say something that hurts our feelings, and listen and change our own behavior if someone else tells us that we have done that, even if we didn't realize it. We've got to be ready to follow the leadership of people of color and look for all those ways we can support systemic change. Lots of people are calling our name to continue this journey. That's how I have found myself hearing the lyrics of our opening song, Hush. When I sing, "Somebody's calling my name," it evokes for me not only the spirit of life and love, who calls me to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but somebody's calling my name is also my grandparents and that land, and my mother, who instilled in me an admiration for leaders like Dr. King. Delphia and all the ancestors on the other side of my child's family are calling my name too, urging me on. Denny Davidoff is calling all of our names, cheering us as we continue to do the hard and important work of racial justice. All the Unitarians and Universalists revered for their work to abolish slavery are calling us on. James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, our UU martyrs who died while supporting the civil rights movement, are calling us on. The children in this community are calling our names. What legacy will we leave them? How much further will we take our nation on this journey toward wholeness in our lifetimes? Dr. King knew he would not live to go beyond the mountaintop and arrive in the promised land of beloved community, but he was still happy to do his part. And he is calling on all of us. Don't stop there. So I invite you to live with the question, who is that somebody calling your name? Who is calling your name to learn more, notice more, and break the silence? To speak out and work for change. So many voices. Let us heed that call and let us build up a new world, a world in which people of all races can take pride in what we have built together. May it be so. Amen.